Phil said, what do you do with all that change when you bring it home? And I can tell you what happens at our house. Charlene does the laundry, and anything in the pants pockets becomes like, I go, where did my change go? There's a bunch of it right here on my dresser. Where did it go? It's like stealing. She's like Robin Hood. Stealing from me to give to the cross. Anyway, it all works well. It all works well. Hey, I don't know if you guys have been following the this season of Jeopardy. I don't usually follow it, but once in a while I go over to my dad's house and he kind of watches it. But there's a guy who's like going crazy winning at Jeopardy right now, right? Are you familiar with this? James Holzhauer is his name, Holzhauer, something like that. But so far in 22 games, he's won $1.7 million. He's a professional gambler from Las Vegas. Like, I bet they'll start checking that stuff earlier, or a little better, right? Later on down there, it's like, we can't have another one of those guys. But he's won $1.7 million in 22 episodes. He's not the highest winning Jeopardy player. That's another guy. That guy's name is Brad Rutter. I don't know if you know that name. You probably don't. Why would you? That's why I'm here. I do this kind of research for you because I use my time wisely. But he won like $4.3 million. He's never been beaten. But he didn't win it all in one winning streak, right? He came back multiple times and he's won $4 million. He's only ever been beaten by a computer. Okay, so he's never been beaten. So it'll be interesting if he gets to play with Holzhauer at some point. But that's a lot of money. The interesting thing about Jeopardy is it's one of those games that's like backwards, right? I have a difficult time watching Jeopardy with wanting to answer the question once the contestant gives you the answer. You know what I mean? So the way that it works is that Alex Trebek gives you the answer, then you have to give the question, right? Here's the answer. What is? And every time after the contestant says, what is, I always want to answer the question again. And by the way, I do want to say this because it needs to be said. I'm not trying to brag here, but when there was a Bible category, I actually beat Holzhauer to the name. I'm just saying. If there was only one category, I think I might be able to hold my own with the guy. And I don't know anything about all the rest of that stuff. But it's kind of an interesting game, right? So you get the answer, then you get the question. But that's not normally what happens in terms of how we get questions. Usually it's the question, and then we answer. The question's usually an opportunity for somebody to either get information or test us, right? It's like if I ask you a question, I might genuinely not know the answer to the question. I might be looking for the answer. Or sometimes, and you know this happens like when we're up here preaching, sometimes we ask a question, you go, okay, I know that I probably don't have exactly, I know he's looking for something. It's not just anything, unless I say something like, any answer is right. And by that, I usually mean not any answer is right, but I want you to be comfortable with your answer, right? But questions and answers are interesting because they wake us up to new ideas and things that we need to think about. But sometimes questions are really odd questions. And I think Jesus asks some odd questions. We're in this series called Postscript, and it's the words of Jesus between his resurrection and his ascension. And today I want to go back to John chapter 20 and talk a little bit about the questions that Jesus asks Mary when she first comes to the tomb. Because they're interesting questions, but they're odd questions. Mary comes to the tomb. She goes in, she sees these two angels, one at the head and one at the foot of where Jesus was laying, who say to her, Mary, why are you weeping? Then she comes outside and there's Jesus, and she supposed him to be the gardener. She said, where did you put the Lord? But he asked the same questions. Why are you weeping? And then whom are you seeking? Seems like odd questions to me at the time. But there are two questions that are interesting questions. Let's take a look at that text. First, in John chapter 20, beginning in verse 11. It says, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. And they said to her, woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. And Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to the Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. These are interesting questions to me. Why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? They're a little bit like the questions that God asks early in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, right? You remember in Genesis chapter 3 where Adam and Eve have taken from the fruit, the tree that they shouldn't have taken from, and God shows back up in the garden because there's a routine of them talking and walking together. And he shows up in the garden and they're nowhere to be seen, and he says, where are you? Right? Where are you? But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, where are you? And then there's another question that he asked in verse 13 of Genesis chapter 3. What have you done? Right? Then the Lord said to the woman, what is this that you have done? And the woman said, the serpent deceived me and I ate. And then to Adam, well, the woman gave it to me. Right? And it was like somebody else's fault. But they're interesting questions, aren't they? Because they are questions God knows the answer to. He doesn't not know where they are, and he doesn't not know what they've done. And yet he asks these questions. They're interesting questions. They're odd questions in a way. They're not questions to get information, right? That's not what they're for. And I think that when we look at the New Testament, we find Jesus is one of the best question askers. There are a bunch of questions that Jesus asks in the New Testament. Actually some questions that kind of make sense to us. One of the questions that he asks is, who do you say that I am? That's an important question. I kind of need to know who you say that I am, because that matters in terms of how you walk out the door here. And then, do you believe? At one point he asked the disciples in Mark chapter 8, do you still not see? Like, we've been doing this for a while and you still don't get it. In John chapter 6, this is a really interesting question. Remember, Jesus in John chapter 6 is talking about really odd stuff. He's saying, if you drink my blood and eat my flesh, those are the words he uses, by the way. If you drink my blood and eat my flesh, then you can be my disciple. If you don't, then you can't. And it's like as many people went away, right? They just were like, okay, we're out. We're not going to do that. That's a wrong thing to do. And he turns and he looks at the disciples and said, what about you guys? Are you leaving too? To which they said, actually, we're not sure where we would go from here, right? I mean, that's a question that's interesting. Are you also going to leave? Often he asks this question, well, what does the scripture say? Like when Jesus is asked a question like, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He's like, well, tell me what you think it is. What does the scripture say it is? In John chapter 21, we're going to get to this in this series. Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? He wants to know the answer to that question. In Luke chapter 6, he says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? That doesn't make sense, right? You should, if you're going to call me Lord, you should be doing what I say. And so those are the kind of questions that make some sense to me. One can understand at a first glance why he's asking, but there are others that frankly just seem like the oddest questions. And it doesn't seem like Jesus doesn't it seem like he just asks odd questions at interesting times? Jesus is a person who asks a lot of questions. Think about the following questions that Jesus asks in the New Testament narrative. One is John chapter 5. Do you want to get well? Here's the story. There's a man who's been by a pool, and he's been there for years, more than 30, almost 40 years, and he's a crippled person, can't walk. And when the pool gets stirred, whoever gets in first, it's an odd story anyway, but whoever gets in first gets healed. And Jesus comes in, and he says to the guy, do you want to get well? Like, right, it's an obvious question, isn't it? Do you want to get well? In Matthew chapter 8, verse 26, Jesus asked the disciples in the boat when the storm is threatening them, why are you so afraid? Well, death seems imminent, right? We've been out here before. It must have been a whale of a storm, right? If you have disciples who were fishermen who've been on that lake a lot and they're afraid. Why are you so afraid? Matthew chapter 14, Peter, always the guy who wants to try something, right? Jesus is walking towards them on the water, and Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. And Jesus says, well, come ahead. I wonder if Peter thought he was going to answer those like, I don't know, come ahead. Peter steps out of the boat, takes a couple of steps, and then looks down and starts to sink. And Jesus says, why do you doubt? I think this is an odd question. Why would you not doubt? I'm walking on water. This is not a normal thing. There are no stepping stones here. It's actually water, right? He starts to sink. Why do you doubt? Well, because this is insanity. Mark chapter 5, the woman who's been bleeding for 12 years and has not been able to find a solution comes to Jesus in a crowd and touches him, and he says, who touched me? It's an odd question. In fact, the disciples are like, who didn't touch you? Like, everyone's touching you. It's an odd question. Matthew chapter 20, verse 32. Sorry, I'm not keeping up on my thing here. Matthew chapter 20, verse 32. Two blind men come to Jesus begging for mercy. And Jesus asks them this question, what do you want me to do for you? It would seem like a fairly obvious answer that Jesus would get. And so the specific odd questions we look at seem like the answer would be obvious. Do you want to get well? Yeah, certainly. Yeah, you would think he wanted to get well. Why are you afraid? There's good reason. Everybody knows it. Why do you doubt? It's the first time I've walked on water. Who's touched me? Everybody touched you. What do you want me to do for you? We're blind. Be nice to see, right? But it seems to me that it's not always that obvious. And we ought to ask ourselves why Jesus is asking these questions. And there seem to be at least two reasons that I think Jesus asks these questions. The first one is this: the answers actually aren't always obvious. They aren't always obvious. The first question, do you want to get well? Not everyone does. Not everyone wants to get well. It's just the case that not everybody wants to get well. Some of us like to live in the circumstances we're in, and we've become accustomed to it. Sometimes the negative circumstances we're in actually become our identity, right? It's who we are, and we can't not be that person. And sometimes that's okay, to say, hey, this is my life, this is the way it is, and that's going to be okay. My younger brother, Dan, some of you have met my brother Dan. When he was 2 years old, or a little less than that, he was scurrying around in a walker, and my mom was ironing clothes, and he pulled this iron onto himself, and it just really, really burned him badly. And he's still very, very badly scarred. I mean, now he's, just a little younger than me, maybe, I don't know how old he is, 54, something like that. And we were talking a couple of years ago, and I was talking to him about that scar, and he said, yeah, I've been to this doctor who thinks he could actually sort it out. He could fix it and relieve some of the stress on my neck, and it just goes down his neck and across on his shoulder. I said, wow, that's interesting. I said, are you gonna have the surgery done? He said, I don't think I'm gonna. I've lived with it all my life. It's kind of, in a way, I don't know what it would change if I got it fixed, and it just cost a lot of money, and it's okay. And so he hasn't gotten it fixed. It's really interesting. His daughter just had a little boy whose name is Elijah. I think when I look at his face, I think that's what my brother would look like without the scar, because he really, this little fellow looks a lot like my brother. But in that regard, it's okay. It's not like he's not debilitated or disabled because of it. So he's going to keep it. It's not necessarily something he needs to get fixed. A while back, I was talking to a homeless guy who walked into our building here, and we talked for a little while, and he was out on the street. And it was the first morning that I could remember last fall, that it was 32 degrees, and he was sleeping, out in this spot behind some bushes. And I said to him, where did you come from? I came from California. Why are you here? Like, Southern California is kind of nice this time of year. Dude, you're sleeping in the freezing weather. I said, there's a lot of work around here. Would you like to get a job? And he said, not really. Like, I don't want one either. How are you doing this again? Oh, that's right, you're here. But no, he said, what? Once I get my P.O. box sorted out, they'll start sending my disability checks here to Moses Lake, and then I'll be fine. I'll figure it out, and I'll get a place. Like, I'm just going to tell you, it was not the answer I was expecting to at least get. But I appreciated the honesty. You want to have a job? No, I don't think so. It looks like a lot of work. Well, I have a lot of conversations, honestly, where my sense is that the people are saying, honestly, I don't want to I'm happy where I'm at. Sometimes we want to stay in the situation that we're in. Maybe it's all we know. It's where we find comfort. It's the place that feels safe to us. Even if we know it's a dysfunctional place, it's amazing to me how many people stay in really broken, hurtful relationships. Not necessarily marriages, but any kind of relationships where there's abuse and that sort of stuff. But it's like, I don't know where else to go. This is the only place that I know. This is where I'm comfortable. Maybe in a way it's like my brother. I think my brother feels a little bit this way. If I were to get some plastic surgery and suddenly start showing up, no one would know me. They wouldn't recognize me. How would people know who I am? And so I don't know if it's always a bad thing, but sometimes it's a really unhealthy thing to stay where we are. And so the question, do you want to get well? The question that Jesus asks the man at the pool, I'm convinced was an actual question. It was an actual question. Do you want to get well? Because if this is where you're comfortable and this is where you want to stay, I'm not going to throw you into the pool against your will. And I'm not going to heal you against your will. And sometimes we want to be in that spot. It's the way we get attention. It's the way we get sympathy. It's become our identity. And Jesus will leave us there. You remember his encounter with the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, what do I do to be saved? And Jesus says, well, you do these things in Scripture. And he says, well, I've done those things. And Jesus says, there's only one other thing you got to do. You got to give everything that you have away to the poor. Sell everything you have and give the money to the poor. And he couldn't do it, and he walks away sad. The interesting thing about that story is Jesus watches him walk away sad. Okay, if you want to stay where you are, then that is the choice that you get to make. And so the questions that Jesus is asking us sometimes, while the answers might seem obvious, they're really not. He's not going to force his way in when we might want to stay where we are. But the second reason that I think Jesus asks us these questions are that we need to articulate the answers. Again, these are questions that when God says to Adam and Eve, where are you and what have you done? He knows the answer to the question, but he needs them to articulate the answer, right? And why does he need them to articulate the answer? Well, in this case, confession is really important because it's not telling God something he doesn't know about. It's agreeing with him about what's going on. Like, he needs us to be a part of that process. It's actually an important part of the communication process. And when somebody has sinned against you or done something that's been hurtful to you, it's actually important that they articulate what that was. It helps in the healing process. It helps in the process of understanding. We have to understand the places that we are so that we can move out of those places. And then the second thing is that he asks us because generally when he asks, then he gives a step. Right? When Jesus asks what's going on, and we answer, then he can give us the next step to take. There's a really interesting story. Most of you probably know it in 2 Kings chapter 5 of Naaman. Right? Naaman is the commander of the Syrian army, and he's one of the mighty men, but he's a strange fellow in that he's got leprosy. And so he's going along the way, and Naaman's wife has this Israeli girl in her household who works for her as a servant, and she says to Naaman, if you go to Elisha, he can tell you how to be healed. And so Naaman goes to Elisha, and he says, and Elisha says this to him, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go down to the river, go down to the Jordan River, and dip 7 times. And Naaman just gets angry. It says that he gets angry. He said, this is ridiculous. There's tons of rivers in Syria. Why am I here? This doesn't even make sense. I've been trying, believe me, if I could have washed this off, it would have been gone by now. And so he kind of stomps off. And then his servants ask him an interesting question. They're like, all he asked you to do is to go and wash in the river. Like, what if it works? Why would you not try it, right? Do you want to be rid of this? We traveled all the way here. The river's right down there. Do you want this gone? What's the problem? Right? It's just such an obvious thing. And finally Naaman's like, well, I guess it can't hurt, right? And he goes and dips in the river 7 times. And he's healed. What's the point? It's like the Israelites walking around the city 7 times, blowing a horn, and the whole thing falls down. They go, really? Sometimes God's asking us questions because he wants us to take a step, and then he's going to give us a step. When we acknowledge where we are, he's going to give us a step, and that step often is going to lead us out of the situation that we're in. In John chapter 5, that story of the man by the pool, right? Jesus says, do you want to get well? And the man says, well, I can't because I'm not quick enough to get in the pool when it churns up. And Jesus says, okay, he thinks the answer is, obviously, yes, I do want to get well, but I'm not sure how. I don't know how. And Jesus says, well, just get up and take your pallet and walk. Was he healed if he didn't get up? Have you ever thought about that? Like he didn't just jump, it wasn't like some gravitational force picked him up. Jesus says, all right, you want to be, okay, step and get up. It's going to take a little bit of faith here. You're going to have to stand up, but that's what you got to do, and he does. Sometimes we're asked these questions because it's important for us to, first of all, be honest about whether we want to know the answer ourselves, and secondly, it gives Jesus an opportunity to give us a step. With the odd questions that Jesus asks Mary, actually two questions. First one is, why are you weeping? And whom are you seeking? And they seem like obvious answers. I'm weeping because because Jesus is dead, and I'm weeping. And who am I seeking? Well, I'm seeking Jesus. Right? The answer to both questions are kind of the same. I'm weeping because I'm sad, and I'm seeking Jesus. I came here expecting to find him in the tomb. And odd questions, it seems to me, usually require thoughtful and sometimes painful answers, right? Why was Mary weeping? What is the question? Like, why is she weeping? What's going on? You can say, well, she was sad because her friend died, and that certainly is true. And the answer in that regard ought to be obvious. But here's the interesting thing. She gets this question from two different sources. First, the angels. By the way, did it strike you, or did you even think about it, that Mary does not appear to be afraid of the angels? So I noticed that when I was reading it this time. I think this might be, I don't know this. I haven't researched it, so if you know better, you should be on Jeopardy. But anyway, I don't know of another case where people were confronted by angels that they weren't afraid. Like, they don't say to her, why are you afraid? Or don't be afraid here in this case. They ask, why are you weeping? And then she is confronted by Jesus. She actually is asked this question twice. Why are you weeping? Well, we do know that she's lost her friend and her mentor and someone who had loved her faithfully in spite of her weaknesses and her brokenness. Boy, when you find someone who loves you unconditionally in spite of your weakness and your brokenness, you found something. Don't let go of those relationships. And so she's sad. She's lost someone who loved her faithfully. She believed he was the Messiah. They all thought that. They had hung their hopes on the fact that he was the Messiah. And they had fallen in love with him. Everybody loved Jesus, it seems. There were people who hated him, like the Jewish people, but the Jewish leadership did, but other people flocked to him, and it didn't seem to matter what their life circumstances were, how badly they'd sinned or how much they had messed up. People loved Jesus, and they flocked to him. But still, Jesus asks her the question, why are you weeping? All the disciples are disillusioned and confused because they thought things were going to be one way and they were another. They were hopeless. Hopelessness comes when we think we have the path sorted and it turns out to be different. Now, there are times when we think we know what's going to happen and it becomes a better story. But very frequently, our expectations and reality are different things. Disappointment is what happens when expectation runs into reality. And so the question that I've been thinking about here is, why are we? We know why Mary was weeping. She lost her friend. Her hope was gone. She lost somebody who loved her. But why? What's going on in our lives? What's the sorrow in our life? And what's the source of it? We touched on this a little bit last week, but we need to pay attention to our sorrow because it tells us something about who we are. Dallas Willard taught me this question, not in person, I never met him, but he said, here's a really important question to ask yourself in your spiritual formation. What's bothering you lately? What's bothering you? Why are you afraid? Why are you doubting? Why are you weeping? Why are you not sure? Do you want to be healed? Because it's a question that helps us to move forward in our journey. We think about days like today. It's Mother's Day. And Mother's Day can be a day when expectations and reality don't measure up, can't they? Lots of holidays can be. Your birthday, Christmas, Mother's Day. Lots of things can be, can come against us in those moments. We think about Mother's Day and the sorrow that can be a part of Mother's Day, maybe because there are some ladies who really want to be mothers and can't be. There's a lot of, I don't even understand the depth of sorrow that there is in the heart of a woman who wants to be a mom and can't be for whatever reason. Right? Or the sorrow of a mom who has children who maybe died or have, gone astray or have broken their hearts in some way. I have some friends from the Renovari Institute that I talk to once a month or so. We Skype, and one of my friends had just been talking about that he and his wife, he was going through some spiritual formation, and there was some stuff really bothering him. And what they kind of sorted out was that they had a miscarriage early in their marriage, and they had sort of just blew it off. They had another one later. The baby was a little further along, but they named that second baby. And they mourned that second baby, but they didn't the first one. And not for any reason, they just didn't. And it kind of began to settle in on him that there was something there. There's a lot of pain that comes into our lives in these times. So we learn a lot about ourselves in sorrow. Sorrow is a really significant form of communication. So Jesus says to the woman, why? Why are you weeping? Because when you know the answer to that question, you know what you're missing or what's going wrong. Again, from Trevor Hudson, who's one of my favorite people, weeping is our very first form of communication. I heard him say that, and I was like, come on, how does that make sense? And then it dawned on me, it's the first way we know that a baby's born, right? Now it's different, birth, what do they call it, wards? I don't know what they are. Anyway, the places where babies are born, they're like, you can't get in. You got to, ring the doorbell, and you look in the camera, and if they don't know you, you're not getting in. It's like, it's like a penitentiary only backwards. You can't get in, and you really want to. But it used to be the case when our kids were born, right? People would be standing outside the door. What are they waiting for? They want to hear the cry. And when that cry doesn't come, that's a bad thing, right? So that's the first form of communication. You notice everybody cries when babies are born? I don't deliver a lot of babies, but some of you do, but their babies cry because it's like, why am I here? Right? I think that's it. It was really great where I just was. Why am I here? It's cold. There are people slapping me. I don't like this. I want back in. And grown-ups cry because the baby's there, right? And you've been waiting for that. And there's a fascinating thing that happens when babies are born. I understand it affects some people significantly. I don't really understand that. And weeping's an interesting thing, isn't it? Weeping doesn't just happen at sad times. That's an odd thing about weeping, I was thinking. Weeping doesn't just happen when we're sorrowful. Weeping can be both a sign of joy and sorrow. I was thinking this. For Mary, I think it was both. She went to the tomb weeping because of her sorrow. She left the tomb probably weeping because of her joy. I just picture Mary when she recognizes who Jesus is, falling at his feet and clinging to his feet and weeping with joy and not wanting to leave again, right? Don't send me away. But that's what he does. And so for the disciples, the sorrow and the confusion was in significant measure a loss of hope. Right? This weeping that Mary feels, it's a loss of hope. What happened wasn't supposed to happen, and we don't know what to do, and we're not sure how to walk out of it. And it's the case for all of our lives. We all have it. We all have sorrow. We have sorrow in different ways. And sometimes, we weep for joy as well, but sorrow is the thing that's going on. That's the question Jesus is really asking at this moment with Mary. Why are you weeping? Why have you lost hope? And so this is a curious question to me. I've been doing a lot of inward journeying myself over the last couple of months, and I want to say this to you because I think it's true. Inward journeying isn't that pleasant, actually. It's why most of us don't do it. It's not always pleasant because maybe sometimes it is, and it's always good. It's really helpful and it's necessary because we learn stuff about ourselves, and when we see things in ourselves that seem incongruous with the moment, that ought to cause us to ask a question. It's been an interesting journey. I mean, I kind of joke about it, but the reality is, since the moment we knew that our granddaughter was coming, even before we knew that it was going to be a granddaughter, I can hardly stand it. See, I can hardly talk about it. I don't know why that is. Like Charlotte and I were having dinner. The first time we were having dinner out after we found this news out, and I started talking about it, and I started to kind of get like I am right now, right? And you're like, I really hope he hurries up through this. But she looked at me and she said, what is this? This is like interesting. Like, thank you. Maybe I could be a science experiment for you, but I was like, what is, and I don't know what it is. I actually truly don't know. I've been trying to sort it through. But it's an interesting thing. But we learn about ourselves in our moments of sorrow. And even that wasn't sorrow at all. That was like great joy. We learn something about ourselves. And so, where are you today? I mean, if you're in a place of sorrow, maybe even joy. Hey, by the way, we should go the same place for both. When we're weeping for joy, we should be thanking God for the good things that he's doing. And when we're weeping in sorrow, we should be seeking him out, because that's what he calls us to. And so the question is an odd one that Jesus asked, because Jesus is both the one asking the question and the answer to the question. He's asking the question, why are you weeping and whom are you seeking? And the answer is the same. And so I just want to ask you this morning to think a little bit about where life is at for you. You may be in the best time of your life. I hope you are. And if you are, be quick to go to God and thank him for the best stuff in your life. The best stuff in your life. And if you're in a place of sorrow, if life has not gone the way you wanted it to, maybe it's financial. Things aren't happening financially the way you wanted them to. Maybe it's about relationships. The relationships aren't happening the way you want them to, or maybe they're broken or really disturbed. Or maybe it's really just a picture of how we thought life was going to turn out like, and it's not turning out like that. It's how we thought things were going to go with our kids, and it's not going like that. Like, what is it? Why are you weeping? What's the sorrow in your life? What's been bothering you? What's getting at you? What I want to invite you to think about this morning is to not run away from your sorrow or from the desolation. Right? We sometimes use these two words in spiritual formation. Desolation is when we have a sense that God's not there. He's not present. He's not meeting us. And then consolation, those times when he is there meeting us. Those times when we know where he is and he's speaking to us and we're hearing his voice. But we need to let our sorrow drive us to Christ and let our joy drive us there as well. It's interesting how quickly we get disillusioned with God in our sorrow and how infrequently we give him praise in our joy. Don't you think? I think that's a fair statement. It's interesting how quickly we get illusioned with God in our sorrow and how infrequently we give him praise in our joys. But our sorrow can sometimes show us where we've lost hope. One of the Psalms, Psalm 42, one of the Psalms of the sons of Korah, chapter 42, verse 5. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation. This is a call back to praise in the midst of sorrow. But we need to enter into that sorrow and let that sorrow drive us to God to ask those questions. God, what do you want to do in me? What is it that you're trying to teach me? What do you want to draw me into? And so where do you turn in your sorrow, and where do you turn in your joy? Christ wants to be the center of both our sorrow and our joy, and our hope ought to be in him. But we have to find him first, and sometimes that takes reflection, and that takes an inward journey, and that takes not running away. I mentioned to you earlier that I was listening to a sermon by Trevor Hudson this week, and it was about the desert, and he talks a lot about the desert and about loneliness. And he says we must not make big decisions in times of desolation. We need to stay in the desert until we know what it's about. And we need to find God there, and he will find us there. Like Elijah, God shows up. Get up, here's some bread, here's some water, eat. And go to Mount Horeb, because that's where you'll find me. And he goes there. But we have to find him first, right? We have to find him. Sometimes we want to stay in our sorrow and pain and let it define us. And so Jesus, I think, asks us the question again, do you want to be well? Do you want to be well? And so I put that question to you in the midst of your life today, if it's a place of sorrow. Do you want to be well? And it's going to mean stopping and listening, taking a step back and finding and hearing the voice of Christ in the midst of our sorrow. And that's what happens to Mary, isn't it? Why are you weeping? And whom are you seeking? Sir, I'm looking for Jesus. What'd you do with his body? Tell me where it is and I'll carry him away. And he says, Mary. And a moment when she hears his voice calling her name, she knows who it is. And he wants to speak in the midst of our lives, in the midst of our sorrow, in the midst of our difficulty. And so he can turn the sorrow into rejoicing, into sorrow, mourning, into dancing. Psalm 30, I will extol you, O Lord, for you've drawn me up and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you've brought up my soul from Sheol. You restored me to life from among those who would go down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, O you, his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. As for me, I said, in my prosperity, I shall never be moved. By your favor, O Lord, you made my mountain stand strong. You hid your face, and then I was dismayed. When everything was going good, I was praising you, and then I didn't see you all of a sudden, and I was disillusioned, and I was dismayed. To you, O Lord, I cry, and to the Lord I plead for mercy. What profit is there in my death? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you? Will it tell you of your faithfulness? Hear, O Lord, and be merciful to me. O Lord, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord, my God, I will give thanks to you forever. We turn in our moments of sorrow and in our weeping, and we need to seek the Lord. And so here are some questions for us to reflect on, just to think about a little bit. I want to invite you to set aside sometime this week. I don't know how much you can set aside. I'm not going to give you a time, but it needs to be more than a minute. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever time you can just be silent. I want to invite you to do this exercise. I want to invite you to sit just in silence for 5 minutes or so, and then I want you just to ask this question of the Lord. Lord, what is a word that you would have for me in the midst of my day, in the midst of my life, where I am right now? Whether it's in the midst of weeping for joy or weeping for sorrow, or maybe it's just like, I don't know, I'm just kind of here, right? Lord, what is the word that you'd have for me? And then just be quiet. Take a journal or something and just start to journal what you hear from him. Now, here's how you'll know it's from him. It won't be a bunch of condemnation. That's not his voice. Now, it could be conviction, right? There's a difference, isn't there? There's a difference. We were convicted by the Holy Spirit, but we're not going to be condemned. Like, you're never going to make it. I knew you were going to fail me. Those aren't the words from the Father. They could be words of conviction, but they won't be words of condemnation. His words will draw you to himself. I want to invite you to just reflect on that. Why are you weeping? What are the things in your life right now really making you happy? And what's really making you sad? If you're struggling with loss, what have you been using to try to fill the empty space? Like, that's something we need to know. Have you been honest about loss in your life, like my friend? Suddenly recognizing that they had just papered over this really difficult time in their life because probably somebody said, you need to move on. Those might be the worst bits of advice we've ever gotten. Sometimes maybe they're okay. But have you been honest about your loss? Have you been able to express your joy? Right? Do you believe Jesus has something to speak to you? Do you know what that is? I want to just invite you to think about what those next steps are and to soak in those questions. Some of the other questions that Jesus has too. And then the question that he wants to ask us in the end is, who do you believe I am? Because that makes a difference. Do you believe that I'm someone who can step into your situation right now and change it? Because if we don't believe that, then we're not going to be like the guy by the pool who gets up. We're going to sit there. And so these odd questions are real questions. Why are you weeping? And whom are you seeking?